All right, so good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining in today. Before we start, just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we live. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and future, and recognize the very important role that traditional knowledge plays in understanding Australia's climate. So welcome everyone to the final webinar from the Understanding Climate Variability project of the Climate Systems Hub. Today we have two of our most prolific project members speaking about the recent back-to-back El Nino and La Niña events and how they have contributed to the dramatic swings from bushfires to floods that we've experienced over the last 5 years. So first up, we've got Dr. Guojian Wang, who is a research scientist at the CSIRO's Climate Science Center. He co-leads the ENSO and Indian Ocean Dipole project at the Center for Southern Hemisphere Oceans Research. His interest spans from the mechanisms of extreme ENSO and IOD to their impacts on regional and global climate and their responses to greenhouse warming. He will be speaking about ENSO, IOD, and bushfires, and will be followed by Dr. Agus Santoso, who is a senior research scientist at the UNSW Climate Change Research Center, and he's also an adjunct science leader at CSIRO, and an associate investigator at the ARC Center of Excellence for Climate Extremes. He's an editor at the Journal of Climate and a former member of the WCRP Clyde Pacific panel. His research interests include tropical climate variability and global ocean circulation. So please feel free to type in your questions into the chat box and the speakers will address them at the end. So I'll stop sharing my screen and Guojian, you can take it away. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Yeah, let me share my. Yeah, can you see my presentation?
Yeah, all good.
Cool. Yeah. Yes. So hello everyone. My name is Guojian Wang from CSIRO. Today I'm going to talk about the 2019 Australian Black Summer bushfires. The eastern and southeastern Australia experience bushfires almost every year. The 2019 and the 2020 season was particularly severe, referred to as Black Summer bushfire. This is a period of unusually intense bushfire in many parts of Australia in terms of long-lasting, for more than half years, large area coverage, including Victoria, New South Wales, and ACT, and great loss induced. Here are some heartbroken images during this bushfire. So the first part of my talk will focus on, we'll give a brief introduction of the possible influence from tropical interannual climate variability on the 2019 bushfire. Many studies already show that eastern and southeastern Australia climate is strongly influenced by Indian Ocean Dipole, IOD, and El Nino Southern Oscillation, ENSO. In terms of drought, the positive Indian Ocean Dipole, pIOD, and the Central Pacific, CP El Nino, are the two major contributors. So hereafter, we only focus on pIOD and CP El Nino. Firstly, these two panels shows what is a positive Indian Ocean Dipole event. During a positive event, there is cold sea surface temperature, SST anomalies, over the eastern equatorial Indian Ocean, and warm SST anomalies to the west. In association, the deep convection also moves westward and eastern Indian Ocean dries. This is the reason why we call it Indian Ocean Dipole, because of such dipole pattern in both SST and rainfall. The negative IOD is generally an opposite phase to the positive IOD event. To describe the strength of IOD event, we use a dipole mode index, which is a zonal SST gradient between the west and east Indian Ocean, west minus east. The greater the dipole mode index, the stronger the positive Indian Ocean Dipole event. So how does a positive Indian Ocean Dipole event influence Australia drought? During a positive event, the eastern Indian Ocean cools. The low convective heating anomaly can generate an Eastern Indian Ocean raw space wave trend. It started with a high pressure center over the Eastern Equatorial Indian Ocean due to the cold anomalies, and then propagate southeastward, high, low, with a high pressure center south of Australia. This high pressure center is conducive to the drought condition over the southeastern and the eastern part of Australia. As indicated by this rainfall regression pattern associated with a dipole mode index. The message from this plot is that during a positive Indian Ocean dipole event, there is significant rainfall reduction over the southeastern and the eastern part of Australia. Now for the Central Pacific El Nino, climatologically, the deep convection is over the maritime continent here because the warm pool region, warm pool can facilitate the atmospheric ascending motion. Now during the Central Pacific El Nino, there is warm SST anomalies in the Central Pacific Ocean. The deep convection also follows and moves eastward because the deep convection moves far away from the Western Pacific. So there is generally less than normal rainfall anomalies in the broader northern and eastern Australia, as indicated by this rainfall regression pattern associated with the CP ENSO event. The message from this plot is during a CP El Nino, there is a significant rainfall deficit over the broader eastern Australia. To describe the strength of a Central Pacific El Nino, we use a so-called C index. I will not talk about too much details of how to calculate the C index. The only thing we need to know here is the greater the C index, the stronger the CP El Nino event. The Eastern Pacific El Nino is another type of El Nino event. Compared to the Central Pacific El Nino here, the Eastern Pacific El Nino features warm SST anomalies that extends much further to the east, as well as the deep convection. Probably because the deep convection moves too far eastward. The Eastern Pacific El Nino, however, do not have a clear impact to Australia rainfall. So during either pIOD or CP El Nino, as rainfall decrease, cloud cover reduce, the surface temperature increase in the affected regions. This will increase evaporation and accelerate depletion of soil moisture. So in other words, the occurrence of both pIOD and CP El Nino can increase the risk of a bushfire. Here we plot the time series of dipole mode index as indicated by the blue curve. And we define a positive Indian Ocean dipole as when the DMI is greater than 0.5 standard deviation. We also plot the time series of the pIOD event is as indicated by the blue dot. And each blue dot indicates one pIOD event that happened in the past. We also plot the time series of a C index as indicated by the bars. And we define a CP El Nino as when it is greater than 0.5 standard deviation as indicated by the pink bars. So each pink bar indicates one CP El Nino event that occurred in the past. Compare these two time series. One thing really drawing our attention is if you focus on the end of the time series here, 2018 and 2019 are both 2 years of positive Indian Ocean dipole. They are also both 2 years of CP El Nino. And such 2-year consecutive concurrences of both CP El Nino and pIOD, such climate sequence, it only happened once in history since early 20th century. And once it occurs, it has cumulative depleting impact on the soil moisture. As highlighted by this plot from Bureau, you can see that it was extremely dry over the eastern part during 2018 and 2019. So the take-home message for the first part of my talk is the 2018 and 2019 2-year consecutive concurrence of both CP El Nino and pIOD, such climate sequence, contribute to the drought condition over the eastern Australia. This facilitated and preconditioned the 2019 mega bushfire. The cumulative impact of the 2018 and 2019 climate sequence implies a possible influence from the combined climate event to the long-term Australia drought. If you think about the past long-term Australia drought, you may recall the Millennium drought from 1997 to 2009, which is the worst drought on record in Australia. Excuse me. This Millennium drought started from 1997 extreme pIOD event and fueled by 4 continuous CP El Nino from 2001 to 2004 and 2 consecutive pIOD events from 2006 to 2007, then terminated by the 2010 La Niña event. Agus is going to talk about La Niña's influence on the flood that happened in the past 2 years. So whether more occurrences of pIOD and CP El Nino can contribute to a more serious long-term Eastern Australia drought or not is a focus of the second part of my talk. In this part, we only focus on the influence on the eastern part as indicated by the box here, where both pIOD and the CP El Nino have a significant impact. The result shown here is based on a 21-year sliding window calculation. The black curve indicates the total occurrence, is the total occurrences of both pIOD and CP El Nino for every 21 years. For example, the end of the black curve at 2010. This means that the pIOD and the CP El Nino have happened in total 13 times from 2000 to 2020, centered at 2010. We also calculate the Eastern Australia rainfall anomalies in the same manner as indicated by the blue curve. So comparing these 2 time series, we can see that they are strongly and also negatively correlated to each other, implying that more occurrences of pIOD and CP El Nino corresponding to a more serious long-term Eastern Australia drought. And replacing the rainfall anomaly by the soil moisture generate a similar result as indicated by the panel B. So the soil moisture here is based on upper 1 meter layer depth. So the take-home message from the second part of my talk is that more occurrences of pIOD and CP El Nino within a time window can lead to a more serious long-term Australia drought. Coming back to the 2019 bushfire, one of the most important following up question is whether such kind of bushfire will occur more often in the future. However, most current climate models cannot directly simulate the strength of bushfire. So what can we do? For the first part of my talk, we already know the 2018 and 2019 climate sequence preconditioned the 2019 bushfire. So if the climate models project more occurrences of such precondition, it might mean that the 2019 kind of bushfire is going to occur more often under global warming. So the last part of my talk focus on the projected changes in such 2-year consecutive concurrence of pIOD and CP El Nino like a 2018 and 2019 climate sequence by using 23 climate models comparing 20th century and 21st century. The 21st century is forced under a high CO2 emission scenario to mimic the impact of global warming. Here it shows the result, a relationship between C index and the dipole mode index for the 20th century and 21st century. Each dot here indicate 1 year for one model. Because we have 23 models, so there are 2,300 dots in each panel. The red dot indicate the 2-year consecutive concurrence of pIOD and CP El Nino, similar as 2018 and 2019 climate sequence. And by counting them, we can calculate its frequency. And it is projected from 5 events per 100 year to be 6.5 events per 100 year. So there is increase, but not much, and may not be significant. So we can make a conclusion here. Greenhouse warming does not seem to induce more occurrences of such precondition to the 2019 bushfire. However, the main state of Australia is projected to be drier in the future, especially over the southeastern and the eastern part, as indicated by this panel, which shows the mean state change in rainfall between the 20th century and 21st century. And such drying impact can be exacerbated by the background warming of around 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. This will increase the potential evaporation and deplete further the soil moisture. So the greenhouse warming induced drying and warming background trend is likely to make future preconditions more extreme in terms of rainfall deficit, even though such precondition is not going to occur more often under global warming. Now, to summarize here, the 2-year consecutive 2018 and 2019 pIOD event, together with the CP El Nino, they preconditioned the catastrophic bushfire in 2019. More occurrences of pIOD and the CP El Nino within a time window can contribute to the long-term Eastern Australia drought. Modeling suggests that the greenhouse warming doesn't induce more occurrences of such precondition. However, as there is a background, as there is a drying trend and the background warming, the impact of such 2-year consecutive concurrence is likely to be more severe. I will stop here. I will answer questions following Agus' talk.
Hey, sorry. Yeah, so I'm Agus Santoso. I'm from UNSW, and I've been asked to talk about El Nino Southern Oscillation, in particular 2020-22 La Nina, and ENSO future projections. And this work is in collaboration with many people, including Wen Chu-chai, Guojian Wang, Mike McFadden, and Andreas Tasketo, and several others. Okay, so over the past 2 years, we've been seeing lots of headings in the media, like occurrences of La Nina that was established in September 2020, and it has caused lots of flooding and heavy rainfall that caused hardship for the community. And with that, it also give this La Nina and El Nino events media coverage and educate the public as well. And the La Nina was not going away. So there was talk about this conversation article, for example, Exosun La Nina, why we're coping these 2 soapy summers in a row, and then where's all this water coming from? And in fact, there's a prospect for another La Nina towards the end of the year. And that is a bit concerning for communities that have been affected by floods in particular. So in this talk, I will first start with a brief introduction of what ENSO is, and I'll talk about the recent La Nina developments, followed by ENSO future projections and summary. Okay, so I hope everyone is quite familiar by now about what La Nina is. It's basically enhancements of the strong trade winds across tropical equatorial Pacific. And with that, you have a moisture confined over maritime continent north of Australia, bringing lots of moisture and ascending branch of the water circulation. And so Australia tends to be wet during La Nina. And also, we want to note that there is an increase in sea level. And with the increase in sea level over maritime continent, it actually promotes more ocean flow from the Pacific into the Indian Ocean, and it's called Indonesian through flow. El Nino is the opposite of La Nina in general terms, and El Nino tends to be accompanied by positive IOD, and La Nina with negative IOD. And this Indonesian through flow, I want to mention that it's important component of the Niño variability. And in 2011, due to the enhancements of the Indonesian through flow, there was a very extreme marine heat wave, which affected the marine ecosystem there. And this picture from Neil Holbrook, part of the book that we published early last year. Okay, so I want to note that this is an ENSO pattern, and we use different indices to capture ENSO variability. The most common one is the Niño 3.4 index, which is also used by many forecasting agencies, including the Bureau, to issue ENSO outlook. And in the East, Niño 3 region is where extreme El Nino tends to peak. And in the Central Pacific, with Western Pacific, which is the Niño 4 region, is where extreme La Nina tends to peak. If we plot the standard deviation of Niño 3.4 index for each month, we can see how ENSO tends to peak towards the end of the year. And the power spectrum also shows that ENSO is an irregular oscillation that has strongest power around 4 years. Okay, I want to note also that ENSO impact it also spreads across the world. And so this is a pattern for El Nino impact, which is dry over Australia, but it also can induce a wet condition over southwestern United States. And because of the weakening of the Walker circulation, we get a subsidence over India, and that can fail the monsoon rainfall there. There's an impact over South America. This is a picture from our review paper published just about a year ago. And I want to note here that ENSO also induce stationary Rossby wave frame, which extends towards South America. And this kind of pattern, which is stronger in September, October, November, brings wet condition over Southeast Brazil. And this Pacific South American pattern is strong in September, October, November, but in December, January, February, the Pacific North American pattern is strongest, and that also affects the northern part of South America. And ENSO has an influence on the meteorological variables that affect a country, and here's for Australia. How do we put ENSO in terms of Australian climate drivers? It's not just ENSO, there are many other components like Indian Ocean Dipole, Mediterranean oscillation, subannular mode, and with that all those meteorological factors like blocking high, cutoff lows. Of course, ENSO is an elephant in the room because it's the largest, strongest interannual variability on the planet, and that can modulate all these synoptic processes as well. Okay, so here we are experiencing wet conditions, and we don't know when it's going to end. And all this drama has been highlighted in special statements issued by the Bureau of Meteorology. Started off in March 2021 when there was significant flooding affecting Eastern and Central Australia from 17 to 26 of March. And in fact, it was the wettest week for Sydney, New South Wales, since national daily records began in 1900. And not long after, in 2002 February, there was an issue regarding how November 2021 was Australia's wettest November since 1900. And that was associated with developing La Nina, they say. And also in Eastern Australia, there was also influenced by a positive phase of the southern annular mode, which contributed to the high rainfall. And more recently, just a few weeks ago, the statement was about extreme multi-day rainfall, significant flooding affecting southeastern Queensland, eastern New South Wales from February to March. And it was sustained rainfall coupled with saturated soils in catchment, caused major flooding across catchment in southern Queensland and eastern New South Wales. So where all this water come from, you may ask. So here is a study by Kimberly Reid and co-authors, showed how the March 2021 Sydney floods were associated with very high integrated water vapor transport. As we can see from this figure, on the 18th of March, there was an inflow of moisture from Tasman Sea associated with blocking high. And subsequently, over the next few days, sources of moisture from the tropics kicked in. And the maximum daily integrated vapor transport over Sydney sit at the top of 0.3% since 1980. So that is very high, extreme. And these authors also examined 16 climate models from CIMIP6 database and found that the probability of events with similar magnitude to this March 2021 event is projected to increase by about 80% by the end of 21st century under both moderate and high emission scenarios. So, and next is, I want to highlight this study by Chiara Holgate, showing that La Nina can influence moisture transport over Eastern Australia. And here we use a three-dimensional back trajectory model driven by 3-hourly atmospheric fields from weather research forecasting model to track the source of moisture supplying precipitation over Northern Murray-Darling Basin, which is the region highlighted in blue contours there. And this studies between 1979 to 2013. It was found that the highest source is over the Tasman Sea and Coral Sea, and La Nina events tend to increase this moisture source, and even more so when La Nina occurs with negative phase of the Indian Ocean Dipole and positive phase of the SAM, which is associated with enhanced easterly flows from the ocean into this NDP region. Okay, so to get a historical perspective of this recent La Nina events, let's look at the Niño 3.4 index time series since 1950. So here La Nina and El Nino events are defined when the magnitude of this index is greater than 0.5 degrees Celsius. Multi-year La Nina events are indicated here in thick blue bars. And then we will then examine how the rainfall anomaly over the East Coast and soil moisture anomaly associated with this back-to-back La Ninas. But first, I want to point out that these are the back-to-back La Ninas, and which I define as a La Nina event preceded by another La Nina in the previous year. And this also applies for the La Nina in a triple La Nina sequence. For example, this one. So, because I take that as a back-to-back La Nina because it's preceded with another La Nina before in the previous year. So in total, there are 9 back-to-back La Ninas. And we can also note that this triple La Nina event taken as a whole is actually quite a rare occurrence since 1950. So there was one in 1973 to 1975 and 98 to 2000. And potentially there will be another one at the end of the year. And you can notice that this multi-year La Nina tend to be preceded by a strong El Nino. Why? Because a strong El Nino tend to discharge heat from the equatorial Pacific, and that the heat depletion preconditions for a La Nina to develop. Okay. And we can notice also there are 9 single La Nina events. And you can notice how these are in general a weaker event compared to the first year of the back-to-back La Nina. So that's actually relevant information for interpreting how it affects soil moisture over the East Coast. And so these bottom panels are showing 3 months average rainfall normally, average over that region indicated in the left panel. Red dot is where Sydney is, just as a reference. The gray shading is a one standard deviation spread for single La Ninas, and all the lines are for the first year back-to-back La Nina, the second year back-to-back La Nina, the 2020 event and 2021 event. Okay, and where I put circles indicating where the values are statistically significant from the single La Nina. the values between the first year back-to-back La Nina and the second year are not necessarily to be significantly different. Okay, that's an important thing to note. So the first year of back-to-back La Nina tends to have a high rainfall, and which leads to a high soil moisture anomaly towards the end of the year. The second year back-to-back La Nina tend to have a weaker rainfall, but it also leads to a high soil moisture anomaly, which are not statistically different from the first year of the La Nina, which supports the notion that there is this soil moisture saturation, and that can exacerbate the risk of flood. In terms of the recent event, the 2020 rainfall anomaly for the East Coast is not very significant, extraordinary at in the first year, but the following year, early next year, like February, March, is quite high, and that leads to a kind of high soil moisture, which is maintained over the course of 2021, and that is enhanced by the very, very high rainfall normally in spring in 2021, which leads to a high soil moisture content. So that is it. So next, I want to note that the top panels are composite rainfall for all La Ninas since 1950. It's showing for the September, October, November average, December to February, and February to April. While the bottom panels are for 2021, DJF, and the following March to April average in 2022. So I want to note here that the impact of La Nina is not always the same every year when they occur. As mentioned before, there are various processes occurring in any given year, but also there is diversity among ENSO events themselves. And as Guojian has mentioned in his talk, we can use the EP or Eastern Pacific Index and Central Pacific Index to examine ENSO diversity. So here's time series, and we can see how the 2021 event is in fact a strong Eastern Pacific La Nina, while the 2020 event was in fact a Central Pacific La Nina. And you can also notice here how most La Nina events are Central Pacific type, while Eastern Pacific La Nina is actually quite rare. There was a pretty strong one in the 1960s. Okay. So what's the future holds for La Nina and ENSO in general? We examined this issue across several publications over the past 10 years using different generation of climate models. And here is a paper published in 2015, finding that the frequency of extreme La Nina events increase under greenhouse warming. And extreme La Nina events are defined as those that tend to peak in the Central Pacific. And why such events increase? So the frequency doubles from 1 every 20 to 23 years to 1 in every 13 years. Why increase? Because of the projected faster mean warming of the maritime continent compared to the Central Pacific, and that enhances the trade winds in that particular region. And also the vertical upper ocean stratification, or the temperature gradients, actually increase. Greenhouse warming tends to hit the ocean surface faster than the deeper ocean. So this change in mean climate actually enhances acid coupling that are favorable for extreme La Nina developments. And in fact, 70% of the increase in extreme La Nina is due to the increased frequency of extreme El Nino events. And the increased extreme El Nino events are associated with the overall projected weakening of the water circulation, and also enhanced acid coupling due to enhanced upper ocean stratification. Here, I want to note that about intermodal consensus in ENSO projections. If this is based on CMIP 5, past studies was based on CMIP 5, there was no intermodal consensus for CMIP 5 models. If we look at how sea surface temperature variability changed at each grid point over the equatorial Pacific. But if we look at rainfall change, rainfall variability change, there is a very strong intermodal consensus across CMIP 5 models. So why these differences? So the increased intermodal consensus for rainfall, it highlights the important role of the mean state warming. Okay, so the main message is that it doesn't matter whether ENSO is going to change or not, but the impact is expected to be more extreme. And this is a review paper just synthesizing what we know so far. This was published last year. First, we start off looking at what the observation shows in terms of sea surface temperature variability. So if we look at data from 1900, we can see how the Niño 3 index, Niño 3 variability, the Eastern Pacific ENSO, is actually increased before 1960 to after 1960. And in terms of the Niño 4 variability, it's also increased pre and post 1960. And that highlights the role of dominant role of extreme El Nino after 1960s and occurrences of extreme La Niñas after 1960s. And the model projections show that all of 23 CMIP 6 models that were considered in the study, so 100% in the model consensus, indicate an increased Eastern Pacific ENSO variability, while quite a strong in the model consensus, 65%, generate an increase in Central Pacific variability. If you look at bottom panels, the message is that there's an enhanced variability associated with increased occurrences of extreme Eastern Pacific El Niños and extreme La Niña events. Also, at the star indicates that extreme El Nino followed by extreme La Niña nearly triples in frequency between the present and future. Even if we do not do any model selection, the majority of CMIP 6 models generate quite a strong intermodal consensus. So why there was no intermodal consensus in CMIP 5? There was probably because the model biases in CMIP 6 in general are actually reduced somewhat. And this is a picture from a paper by Spencer McKenna showing how the cold tongue bias in the Equatorial Pacific, which is a persistent bias across previous generation of models, have been reduced. And that can have implications on ENSO dynamics, I believe. Okay, so in this brief communication, we say that even if we do not do any model selection, we just use all CMIP 6 models. And we do not need to separate between Niño 3 and Niño 4. Just look at Niño 3.4. There is a robust increase across models, majority of models, of enhanced ENSO variability in high emission scenarios, moderate and low emission scenarios. Just to highlight again, with what I said previously, that the impact of ENSO, no matter what, whether ENSO does not change, it will likely become more extreme, and because of the change in the ENSO to teleconnection amidst the change in the background warming. So overall, the mean convection centers shift eastward, and rainfall responses strengthen during both CP and EP ENSO events. Many regions affected by ENSO in present climate are likely to experience more intense ENSO-driven rainfall variability in the future. And because the mean state moisture increase and the ENSO variability also increase under greenhouse warming, the asymmetric atmospheric response between El Nino and La Niña are also expected to increase. And this message has been reinforced by recent studies. And here is a study by Shane McGregor looking at CMIP 6 models, that ENSO teleconnection changes are found over 50% of teleconnected regions over the world in December, January, February, between past and future. And large majority of these projected teleconnection changes suggest an amplification of historical teleconnections. So where, places where are impacted by ENSO is going to be expected to be further impacted in the future. And these teleconnection changes are largely scale with projected warming level, which has implications for how we manage risk in the future. One point I want to note is that, as Guojian mentioned before, Australia is projected to be drier in the future. So this study by Francois and Scott, it actually, give a scenario. How can Australia be drier, but how can we also get extreme rainfall? I would encourage you to read this paper. I think I'm running out of time. Just want to do one more slide. Yeah, so ENSO variability change is also expected to impact on a host of processes. And this study that I had published earlier this year show how the projected change in ENSO variability also impact on the projected change in Indonesian truthful variability, which has implications on the Nino rain heat wave. Okay, so in summary, the 2021-22 events materialized as back-to-back La Nina of a strong Eastern Pacific type following a Central Pacific La Nina in 2020-21. And back-to-back La Ninas tends to be stronger than single La Nina events and leads to soil moisture saturation over the east coast of Australia. Extreme La Nina and extreme El Nino events are projected to occur more frequently under future warming, and CMIP 6 models show more robust results. Nonetheless, the impacts of ENSO events in general are expected to be more extreme. ENSO future projections are expected to affect a range of processes such as the Indonesian truthful, which is also important for Nino marine heat waves, and there are studies coming out looking at this aspect. Okay, with that, thank you very much. Any questions?
Yeah, thank you so much, Agus and Guojian. That was really, really interesting. Before we get to questions, I also wanted to quickly thank Tani for helping to coordinate this and publicize it and helping with the slides. So thank you, Tani. So we have two questions from Artemis Kitsios. So the first question was for Guojian, I think. I think he was referring to your time series where you were correlating rainfall and the events, your 21-year sliding windows. Have you considered doing a similar process for Southwest Western Australia? Even though it is not as extreme as Eastern Australia, we often find lower rainfall conditions during combined positive IOD and El Nino. I think using the future climate data in a similar way would be a benefit for Southwest Western Australia as well.
Right. Yes. Yeah. That's a good point. Although the influence is not as significant as over the eastern part of Australia, the pIOD and CP El Nino can also induce a drought condition in some part of southwestern and western Australia. Yeah, and also their influence can be carried by the changes in the Levant current. So when they weaken the Levant current, it tends to have lower than normal rainfall anomalies over the western part of Australia. So yes, we can repeat our analysis over the western part. If you leave your contact, maybe I can get back to you when I finish the calculation.
Thanks. And then the second question, I think, was for Agus. How do you explain that the CMIP 5 models are not picking up the same ENSO signal, but are agreeing on the rainfall? I think you touched a bit on this, but maybe you can clarify it a bit.
So how can CMIP 5 models capturing not just ENSO variability, SST, but also the rainfall? It's kind of a mix.
Yeah, I think it was your plot that saying, oh, okay. Yeah, it was that they're not agreeing on the ENSO variability, but they were agreeing on the rainfall.
Yeah, so because there are rainfall is affected more by the mean background warming. There's as studies by Christine also examined a few years ago, how El Nino and La Niña precipitation anomalies are non-linearly enhanced by the background warming pattern. While SSTs, there are so many different processes occurring, and many of them are actually overcompensating. For example, there's the damping by, the atmospheric damping is actually increased as well. So that is negative damping for ENSO, while the thermocline feedback, all these positive feedback processes are actually enhanced. So there's a compensating effect. Yeah.
Thanks. We've got a question saying, thanks for these talks. Can either of you consider key implications of these changes for the environments of our Pacific Island neighbors?
Guojian, maybe?
Yes, so Agus already mentioned that the El Nino, the ENSO SST variability is kind of confirmed to increase under global warming. So as similar as ENSO SST variability, the IOD SST variability, the strong event is also going to increase under high CO2 emission scenario. So under global warming, I think those increase in the IOD SST variability and the ENSO SST variability will increase their teleconnections during the for example, El Nino teleconnection, Indian Ocean Dipole teleconnection. So also in terms of extreme event, because when you have increased SST variability, that means the extreme event also going to increase. So you can expect more extreme teleconnection, especially over the Indo-Pacific island.
Yeah, I think it is very dependent as well on which Pacific island, because the SPCZ will change and it falls directly over some islands. I had a question, sneak one in. Do you guys find a decadal signal in all of this? Like Agus, I was looking at your triple La Nina time series, and it seems like it coincides with a phase shift of the IPO. Is that right or not?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Yeah, I think there is some kind of a decadal influence, and in fact, it's quite confusing how to think about this. Does the decadal variability impacting La Niñas, or the La Niñas itself actually making that decadal variability? But this is something that we need to consider in future projections. For example, if you just use very short windows, like 20 or 30 years, comparing the future and past periods, you might not see any change because it's affected by decadal variability. That's why in our studies we use 100-year long period to compare, just to average out those decadal variabilities.
One more question. Agus, can you please comment on the chance of a third La Nina event this year?
Okay, so many climate models actually predicting sort of a weak La Nina. Of course, if you just look at one single model, there's one that produced a strong La Nina towards the end of the year. But if you just look at the spread, it's very large at least currently, but they will be updated again with in the next few weeks. So what is the chance of another La Nina towards the end of the year? It's actually a potential. There's a potential, but the uncertainty is quite large that we don't know for sure. And I don't want to guess. I just not comfortable in commenting on that.
Yeah, maybe I can say something about this. The NOAA prediction, according to them, there is a 60% chance of a La Nina, a third La Nina this year, in July. Yeah.
60% at the end of the year, I think.
Yeah, at the end of the year. Yeah.
Just a comment here from Andrew Watkins and Bomb saying that's a good answer, Agus.
Yes,
So anyone want to get in any last few questions? Otherwise, we will. I'm really appreciative of your time, Guojian and Agus and Tani. Thank you for doing this. Very, very interesting. And thank you again, everyone, for coming and listening today. Yeah, so if there's no final questions, yeah, we'll end it here. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you.